Mi nombre es Antonio Medina, pero antes de que empecemos, me gustaría por lo menos saber un poquito de ustedes. Yo veo que tú eres de Banco Popular.
Sí.
¿Es quién tú eres? ¿Cuál es tu
Ángel
nombre?
Rivera, presidente de la subsidiaria Popular Asset Management, el investment management arm de Banco Popular.
Muy bien, quizás un... should I do this in Spanish or English?
In English.
Okay, so so sir, could you introduce yourself to give us an idea of who you are and what you do?
Joe Gladue. I manage several funds that are designed for banks to invest in.
Okay, a couple more volunteers so I know what the group is like. Okay, I'll volunteer you.
I'm Jonathan Ramos. I'm the Dean of the School of Hospitality Management at the UPR Carolina.
Wonderful. One more volunteer. All right, you guys did sit in the first row, so.
Sure. Alex Kromarchuk, the firm is Colton Alexander. We're a securities broker-dealer.
All right, so welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me and having me with you today. I'm gonna speak for about half an hour, and then we're gonna have half an hour Q&A. And I think that we should probably cover that time easily. So just 2 cents on me. So I'm an engineer, not the usual engineer that you've met before, but I do have a bachelor's and master's in industrial engineering. I'm a professional engineer, but don't ever cross a bridge if I designed it. That's not gonna go very well. I also have an MBA from the Wharton School of Business, and have spent most of my career really in the intersection between manufacturing and real estate and finance. As it was mentioned, I spent about 20 years with Merck and Company, from a big pharmaceutical company. I did spend about 20 years outside of Puerto Rico, so I lived in Spain, I lived in South America, and Brazil for a number of years, in the New York metro area, and traveled, throughout extensively, as I was in business development for a while for Merck and Company, and we would go to, wherever we needed to go. I decided when I was in my early 40s that I was seeking more meaning to my life, that making money was great, but that I wanted to do something that contributed, where I could put my knowledge to use for the benefit of others. And I decided that even though I was an expat living in Sao Paulo in a beautiful place, and I was a CFO for Merck, I'm friends with Alejandro, who used to be governor, and he was in his campaign, and we were having drinks literally over Cuba Libres, and I said to him, Alejandro, if you win, I want to be in your economic development department. And he said, what are you going to do about Brazil? And I said, no, don't worry about Brazil. You make sure you win, and I'll show up. So he won. I actually came for the elections, and I wanted to make sure that I, was present and voted in case he won and in case that he asked me to join the government. And lo and behold, he won. And within a week, I was with Alberto Bacó in the transition team for Alejandro. And by the end of the month, I was appointed the head of the Puerto Rico Industrial Development Company, PRITCO. Now, those of you that know PRITCO today, PRITCO is just the real estate arm of the Economic Development Department, DDEC. But back then, when I was at PRITCO actually was the one that managed all the manufacturing, all the incentives, all the advertisement of Puerto Rico as an investment destination. So really a much broader scope than what currently PRITCO is today. And it was, I have to say, even though I took a 70% salary cut, probably one of the best jobs I ever had. Great exposure, really provided me an opportunity to understand Puerto Rico as a whole. And again, I'm gonna talk a little bit about history, but it was right after the Act 154 was enacted, which really pissed off corporate America, specifically the pharmaceutical industries, and companies started closing down. So I had the privilege to come down and sit with Alejandro and stop the bleeding and get companies to start growing again. We brought Lufthansa, we brought a number of fairly large investments in the pharma world, aerospace and so forth. We really pushed hard export services, and then the wheels fell off the wagon because we went into the bankruptcy period. And again, I had the privilege to be asked by the governor to be part of the team that negotiated promise in Congress. So I was there in the room, in the meetings where we actually got Congress, specifically Speaker Ryan, to help us by passing the law called Promesa that A, allowed Puerto Rico to have a legal framework to go bankrupt, and B, created the Fiscal Oversight Board. 2016, at the end of the administration, I left government, started my own firm, it's called Convergent, and I do advisory for firms focusing on growth. We do some real estate as well. And around 2020, beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic, I get a call from the US Congress asking me if I would be willing to join the Fiscal Oversight Board as a member. At the time, the first board was, Jose Carrion was the leader, and he was coming to the end of his term, and they were looking at a replacement for Jose Carrion. I'm a Democrat, registered Democrat, and I was a delegate for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 Democrat convention. So this Democrat side of Congress asked me, and I interviewed, and Nancy Pelosi proposed my name. President Trump was the president, so I was actually appointed by Trump to the board in 2020. So I was able to kind of maneuver both sides of the aisle and get appointed on a bipartisan way to the one seat in the board that is required to be either a local resident or a local business owner, and actually qualify as both. The one thing that is important about the board on a personal basis is that it's a pro bono job. If you're on the board, you don't get paid. Even though everybody in Puerto Rico thinks that we make millions of dollars, the 7 members of the board, who are the ones actually making the decisions, don't get paid a cent, unlike the lawyers and the consultants and everybody else around us. Now, I'll go back to my period on the board a little later, but 3 years after that, at the end of my term, I decided not to stay. I decided to go back to private life and continue with my business, which is what I do today. And again, I run my company. I have a couple of companies here. I have a winery in Oregon, so if you ever want some Pinot Noir, let me know. But let's talk a little bit about how we got to where we are. So again, enough about me. I'm gonna go back 30 years, because Puerto Rico in the early 90s and the 80s and the 70s was a really incredible economic growth dynamo. And a lot of that was due to a law in Congress, by Congress, called Act 936. Act 936 did 2 things for Puerto Rico. It attracted jobs by requiring that products manufactured in Puerto Rico, if they were manufactured here and they met certain ratios, they actually could be sold at 0% tax rate in the US mainland. That eventually changed from 0 to 5 to 10%, but still a significant arbitrage versus the taxes paid by products manufactured elsewhere in the world. So Puerto Rico had tremendous growth through the 60s, through the 70s, through the 80s. But we Puerto Ricans decided to give that up. In the Newt Gingrich time, in 1995 or so, our government went to Newt Gingrich and said, you can take 936, we don't need it. This is the time of corporate welfare, if any of you remember that. And what's interesting is that it was offered in exchange for statehood. But it didn't happen. So we got probably the most important economic development tool anybody has ever had, to be able to manufacture at 0% tax rate sales tax in the tax on revenue sales on the US in exchange for nothing. But anyhow, that was grandfathered. So for 10 years, companies that were already under that regime could stay in Puerto Rico. So that puts us on 2006. Anybody remembers the big issue that happened in 2006 in Puerto Rico from an economic standpoint? ¿Cómo?
Was Obama?
No,
Obama,
before. I'll make it easy. No, before that. The government shut down. The government shut down in the summer of 2006, the local government, because with the end of 936, Many companies left Puerto Rico, billions of dollars, and I'm saying billions of dollars, left the local banking because the other rule that I didn't mention that 936 had was it required companies to keep the funds that they made in Puerto Rico for 5 years. So that actually funded the entire economic development for 30 to 40 years of Puerto Rico. I was the CFO of Merck at the time I transitioned Merck from 936 to CFC, Control Foreign Corporation. We pulled out of the banks of Puerto Rico about $2 billion on that night, on November 30th, 2016. That was the last day of the fiscal year, and December 1st, 2006, we became a controlled foreign corporation, and all the money went to Bermuda. So huge hit to the capitalization of the island. Then in the next few years, you know what happened. You mentioned it, the real estate bubble, we had the financial crisis globally, so really money dried up globally. So we already had a recession going in Puerto Rico, and then we got a recession on steroids with all the global impacts. However, our politicians didn't get the memo. So they decided that in order to continue running the government at the same levels they had been running before, rather than reduce spending, they started borrowing. And our bonds were triple exempt. So no state, federal, or local tax. An amazing deal. You could actually get a 7% bond and get 7% without any taxation. And they sold like hotcakes in the market. One of the best products that all the fund managers pushed, because hey, what else can you get 7% with a constitutional promise that they're going to get paid? So what happened? Scoop and toss every year. You would take the shortfall, you would take additional bonds, toss it for the future. By 2013, Puerto Rico owed over $70 billion in taxes. And our local budget at the time was probably $7 billion, the local portion of the budget, with federal transfers maybe 20. So you can start seeing what happened. Basically, in 2013, when we came into government, we all got pulled into emergency meetings, literally as we were just coming in. I don't think it was even January, to talk about how we were going to resolve the liquidity issue that we had, because there really was not enough money being collected to pay the debts. We did one additional bond emission for about 3.25, maybe 3.5 billion. That was in 2013. That was the last one. And it was 5 times oversubscribed. So that was the appetite for the bonds. Meanwhile, Forbes was saying that we were the next Detroit. So really, for the next couple of years, the governor really tried hard, pulling from Peter, robbing from Peter to pay Paul, taking money from the left pocket to put it in the right pocket, until we actually ran out of money. Actual story. I'm sitting in my office, I get a call from Treasury. I had a lot of contacts with the pharma industry. And the Secretary of Treasury says, Antonio, we don't have any money to pay the payroll. Can you raise a couple $100 million over the weekend? And I did. I called some of the large pharmaceutical manufacturers and I said, can we get prepayments on your royalty withholding tax? And I raised about $200 million over a weekend, such that we could pay payroll. Really scary times. So when the current government says, oh, we're going to pay all the reimbursements, ¿cómo se llaman? Los reintegros, and we're going to give you a bonus. Well, it's very easy when you have a ton of money in the bank, a lot of liquidity. But they don't know what not having liquidity is like. Well, then Jennifer should. She was in the house when this happened. But anyhow, so things keep getting harder and harder, and we realize we have to go bankrupt. There's no other choice. There's not enough money to pay payroll, to pay basic services, and to pay the debt. The debt was over 25% of the income from the government at that point. I think it went up to like 28% of the total. Every dollar that came in taxes, 28 cents went out just to pay the service, debt service. So we tried to do a local law to go bankrupt. Bondholders took it to the Supreme Court here, took it down. Then we tried to do EVA, the sales and use tax like they do in Europe. Couldn't get agreement. So with no more alternatives, the governor had to announce that Puerto Rico could no longer pay its debts. And we had to go to Congress and negotiate promesa. So we were able to convince the US Congress to give us the same treatment as cities or jurisdictions that are not states in the US get. Same thing as Detroit, New York, DC. This is the most similar one because it's a similar jurisdiction to Puerto Rico. And after a lot of work and a lot of lobbying, we were able to agree to it. But with a catch. With the framework to go bankrupt, you also get an oversight board that controls the finances of the island. So that's how the board got created. So anyhow, we go into bankruptcy 2016. And then we have Maria in 2017, total disaster. Then we had the pandemic in 2020. And we did have some earthquakes right around end of 2020. So the silver lining to that period of time, so a lot of criticism about, hey, the board has taken so long to do this. But the board got instated at the end of 2016. A year later, Hurricane Maria, disaster for a full year, no lights. Then we're starting to get moving, earthquakes, pandemics, and I get appointed to the board in 2020. So when we came to the board, there's a gentleman called Justin Peterson. He's MAGA, and he's Republican, and he's very much to the opposite spectrum politically than I am. But we're actually very similar. We actually both agree that things need to get done right. The two of us were from the business world. We were deal makers, and we had been in the real business world, versus many of our colleagues who were academics or former judges, very good people. I respect them a lot. But Justin and I really agreed that we needed to get this done. So between 2020 and 23, the focus was on let's get Puerto Rico out of bankruptcy. And we did. Without boring you all with all the details, we were able to cut the debt for the Commonwealth by 50%. So from 70, we ended up with like under 35. But the Democrat in me really pushed hard to make sure that the pensions couldn't be touched. So I was a finance guy, so I did a lot of accrual work on pensions because I ran a pension fund. And I knew that if you actually change the outcomes in later years, you actually change the present value of that actuarial report. So the lawyers would tell me, no, we have to affect the pensions because you have to treat all the different classes the same. So I would argue, we already did. We already took all the employees from the current pension plan to 401k-like. Therefore, the curve changed completely, and when you do the present value, we actually took a significant haircut to the pension cost. Perhaps not to the individuals that are already retired, but definitely to the future expense of the pension. Long story, but that's how we got the pensions to remain at 100% for current pensioners, which to me was a big deal. I'm Puerto Rican at the end, and I do care about the people. So if those of you might remember Natalie Yaresco, she was the first executive director of the board, incredibly bright woman, Ukrainian, and very direct and very stubborn. And I would tell her every time, the work does not end, and this is actually good for you guys. I would like you to take this home. The work does not end when you're given the result from the spreadsheet. That's when the work begins. Because the technical analysis and the numerical work and the present values and all that great stuff, if you're in government and policy, guides you to a decision. But you have to worry about the people implications and how the implementation of those technical solutions will affect real people. Will they be able to pay their mortgage? Will they be able to pay the schools for their kids? Will they be able to continue at the same current standard of living if they're retired and have no alternate income? And I pushed really hard to ensure that we were being fiscally responsible, but ensuring that you had empathy for the people that you were affecting with those decisions. So anyhow, Puerto Rico is out of bankruptcy since 2023. I don't think most Puerto Ricans know it, but because I do hear all the time, oh, because we're still bankrupt. We're not bankrupt. But there's one important bankruptcy that still remains. We had to make a decision while negotiating with the bondholders to take PREPA, the Power Authority, out of the discussion. And all these discussions are in New York, investment bankers. You have investment bankers for the bondholders or for different groups. Our investment bankers, the government of Puerto Rico, all different groups, 100 lawyers in a room. And we have to make a decision. If we want to get this deal done, we have to take PREPA out, because if we keep PREPA in, we're never going to get Puerto Rico out of bankruptcy. So we made a conscious decision to separate PREPA out. Now, if you know a little bit, and I'm sure you all do, about corporate law, PREPA is a separate corporate entity that is fully owned by the government of Puerto Rico, but there is a corporate veil that separates PREPA and the Commonwealth. Therefore, we circled PREPA, pushed it out, resolved all other bankruptcies. There were 12 or 13, if I recall correctly. I think it was 12, and we left PREPA out. So we solved all other bankruptcies by the time I left the board. When I came into the board, maybe there was 1 or 2 resolved. By the time I left the board, we had resolved 12 out of 13. And we actually left, when I left the board, we had already put the plan of adjustment to get PREPA done with 44% subscription on the deal. Why that is important? Because in order to get it approved by the court without much problems, you need 66 or 2/3 subscription from your debt holders. And we had 44. Now, Justin left a month before I did. I left in October. Why did the board not close that deal and waited to what's happening today? I don't know. I was not there. I have my ideas, but I'm disappointed because we were very close to a deal on PREPA. 44% subscription should be close enough that if you had the intent to close the deal, you should be able to close that and get an additional 22% of classes of bondholders join, and then you close the deal. But here we are, 2026. PREPA is still bankrupt. That's why the lights don't work in Puerto Rico. Yes, we have received, by the way, $120 billion of federal money assigned to Puerto Rico. 120 B. I mentioned that the budget of Puerto Rico back then was 7, now it's about 12. So 10 times the budget of Puerto Rico we have received in federal funds. About 50% of it has been deployed now. A lot of money did go straight to the people with the COVID funds, but a lot of the money is being managed by the government, very slowly. But we're about 50% through the deployment of that capital. So that means that for at least the next 5 years or so, maybe a little longer, there will be significant non-recurring federal transfers coming into the economy. Now, I'm not going to drill a lot on this. You can ask me questions if you want specific items, but let's see how much time we have. So we got about 7 more minutes before we go to questions. So I'm going to actually switch gears because I'm actually a very optimistic person. When you understand the story I told you, and we just went with a bird's eye view on the story, you realize that Puerto Rico is actually having the best time it's had in the last 20 years. 20 years. I mean, I go all the time. I do TV and radio all the time. I go to my friends, and everybody says, oh, things are so bad. It's not for Puerto Rico. It's not. Look at housing prices. Look at the GDP growth. Now, sure, the economy is bifurcated. Granted, we have the effect of federal dollars coming in combined with the local economy, and you could argue if you're an economist that if you pull out the effect of the non-recurring funds, you probably are negative on GDP growth. But the facts are the facts. And we have been in positive territory for at least, I'm going to say roughly the last 5 years. We're in 2026. I'm going to go back to 2021 because, of course, 2020 we had the big dip due to COVID. But we've had a fairly strong recovery. Once we came out of bankruptcy, things are moving. You know, if you were in Puerto Rico in 2016, there were no cranes whatsoever. You didn't see a building coming up. And I go to Condado and I see buildings coming up, and I see towers that have apartments for $3 and $4 million bucks. Now, I know there's some real issues like housing for younger folks, especially or younger or people that are not necessarily in the upper echelon of society. That's a real issue. That's an issue that government needs to resolve and figure out how to provide programs for developers for it to be profitable to build that type of housing, because that's the issue. The housing that is getting built is high-end housing because that's where the economics work. And of course, we have Act 60, and I do believe in trickle-down economics, even though I'm a Democrat, but I do believe that if you bring a significant amount of foreign investors, i.e. Act 60 and Act 22, and you plug them into the island, not only do you get fresh money into the economy, people that are going to buy homes and go to the church and put their kids in schools and buy cars and go to the grocery store and go to Plaza and Mall of San Juan. Not only that, but also you get transfer of knowledge. Because I have friends that have hedge funds and trading rooms and very sophisticated financial operations today in Puerto Rico, and employ people, Puerto Ricans, that would have never had access to that had they stayed in Puerto Rico under the prior environment. And they're developing these type of careers because there's all these different types of businesses in the island that have been brought in because of Act 22. You know the hate part of it, so I'm not going to go into there. And I also don't really, I'm saying publicly, I don't believe very much in the gentrification, I think that's a word, because there's plenty of depressed areas in Puerto Rico that can actually use investment, whether foreign or local. And I think that there's a lot of misconception about when somebody comes and buys a building, fixes it up, and makes it nice. I think that's good for the economy. And by the way, I do think it's very good to have new developments like Encanto, but that's not the popular thing to say. But that's what I feel. And I'm actually not very quiet about my thoughts. So I actually think Puerto Rico is actually having a pretty good time right now, economically. 5 years of positive GDP growth. We have at least 5 more years with about $50 billion left to be spent on non-recurring. I actually really like Sebastián, the Secretary of Economic Development, who I'm proud to say was my intern when I was the head of PRECO, and I'm very proud to say that was the chief of staff of the board when I was entering the board, and who's a fellow Wharton graduate, Wharton undergrad, Harvard MBA, and Harvard Law, extremely well prepared, and he's done some incredible announcements, like the introduction of Eli Lilly's new facility to do, like the Ozempic and the Mounjaro and those on pill form. It's going to be made in Puerto Rico. Lilly's putting around $1 billion in Carolina for that. Amgen is expanding in Juncos. They're doing about somewhere about $2 and $3 billion new investment in Juncos, and those are the big ones. I think that we need to root for Sebastián and for the governor. I might not agree with her politically, but if they do well, we do well. Now, they do have to move away from the policies of the past of passing laws that are popular in nature and put money in your pocket and my pocket at the expense of the liquidity of the government. Right now, we're looking at a very turbulent time internationally. The market is down, 10%, roughly, or almost 10% over the last few weeks. It was 20% down at the lowest point last year, and it ended up 10% up. It's a 30-point spread. You probably know these numbers better than I do. So we're really living very volatile times. As a very conservative, financially responsible individual, I believe that the government needs to be very careful in the use of its resources. It shouldn't be doing things just for votes. It should be doing things because they make sense and because they provide a better platform for growth for the economy. So I think I'm probably out of my 30 minutes of open discussion, right? All right, So thank you very much. And you got 30 minutes to shoot at me. Who goes first? Yes, sir.
Here in Puerto Rico, we have a very unique environment of cooperatives. Do you see them as a tool going forward, and how do you see them affecting the local economic landscape?
Short answer, yes. Very, very important element of our economy. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's over 50% of the deposits, maybe even higher. I think it's maybe even 60 are in cooperativas. We have a very shallow banking structure. I mean, Puerto Rico used to have, when I grew up, all kinds of international banks, UBS and whoever else. There's none left. Citibank has a small office, not a real office, versus what they used to have. We have 3 major banks, a couple of upcoming banks, like Nave Bank, and we have Oriental First Bank and Popular. They're great, but they're not enough. If you want a really robust economy, you need to have a vibrant banking structure and banking system such that enough money flows for different projects and initiatives to be funded, and we don't have that. I'll give you a personal story. I couldn't get a mortgage. I started my business. I didn't have a W-2, had a lot of expenses in my credit cards because I was starting a business, and I was trying to buy a house in 2017 after the hurricane. I could not get a mortgage. Not perfect, but very decent credit rating. So that wasn't the issue. Not an issue with net worth. An issue with liquidity. And because my business was not steady long-term business that had demonstrated to the banks stability over a long period of time, and we just had a hurricane, I could not get a mortgage from a major bank. I went to a mortgagera, one of the smaller, and I got the loan. But I could not believe myself that after the story I told you and what I've done in my life, I could not get a mortgage to buy a house. And that's because we didn't have enough depth in the market. And of course, after the global financial crisis, all the credit policies became very tight. But yes, going back to cooperativas are very, very important for the fabric of Puerto Rico, because your average person in Puerto Rico might not be using a regular bank as their main institution, whether for deposits. You see people buying their cars with PenFed. I personally use USAA because my father was a military person for my car loans and so forth. So yeah, absolutely. The only problem, but the flip side of this is that there's some cooperativas that are not very well capitalized. So I do think that we have too many cooperativas, and they need to be really pulled together. And let's make sure that the ones that are well capitalized, that can withstand some sort of crisis, then take up some of the ones that are not as well capitalized. But that's perhaps a different story. Next question.
Just a follow-up comment. Why these other banks left the international one? We have Scotiabank that have been here for more than 100 years, and they decided to leave. Even though you say that there may be opportunities, why they're not coming back and establishing here?
3 numbers, 936. Because we had QIPSI funds. The market had, I'm gonna guess, had to be over $30 billion of QIPSI funds at any point in time. I mean, I know at Merck I managed over 2 billion, and yes, I was one of the top 10, but assume that any one of the top 10 pharma had somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion. That's between 15 and 20, and then you have another 20, 30 companies below that maybe had between 500 million and 1.5. So yeah, we probably had somewhere between 30 and 50 billion dollars of money that was looking for a home, and it all went away one night.
And the real question will be from the oversight board and the members of the oversight board, how they look at Puerto Rico growth and probably supporting local folks in the island rather than hiring someone from the mainland. And I'm specifically talking about the pension trust fund that is going to be funded by government money for 10 billion, but hire a consultant that created this investment policy that exclude basically all managers in the island. So it get funded buy the island, buy Puerto Rico taxes, and then hire someone like BlackRock that doesn't create any jobs, doesn't pay any taxes locally, and then you basically leave behind an industry that could flourish with some allocation of those funds.
So I'm gonna separate your question in two. How does the board sees Puerto Rico? The board puts a fiscal plan. It's actually available online if you go to the Fiscal Oversight Board, and it actually goes about 40 years because you need that to negotiate bonds. When you go and negotiate your bonds, you need to provide them your financial projections for the island. It's very thorough, very detailed. If you ever need to go to sleep, open the website and you'll be asleep within the next 5 minutes. But yes, I've actually read and was part of putting together a lot of those fiscal plans. Very, very detailed. Surprises me that so few people look at it, because in fact it's there, it's available, it's online. The board also had an economic forum about a month ago, which I think there was a mention that was 3 lines in the newspaper. But yeah, the board actually brought in independent economists, both local and international, to give their view on macro as well as local economics. So the board takes a long-term view on matters. They are not looking at the next quarter, they're looking at the next 10, 15, 20, 40 years in their projections. So that's a separate question than the second one. Now, I was there when we created the pension board, and I actually made sure that a Puerto Rican called Desiree Mieses was appointed to that board. I actually pushed for Desiree to be put in that board. But the board decisions are independent than the Fiscal Oversight Board. Once we put it into play, once the board was named, they are the ones that get to make those decisions, like who do they trust for the pension funds. So I cannot comment on the actual choosing of one player versus the other, but the thing I can tell you is that I pushed and I made sure that there was a local Puerto Rican with local content and experience as part of the board. I think that's still part of the board as far as I know. But
There's Olivier as well.
yeah, so that's as much as I can tell you about that.
No, I met with them and they can pay because they're just 2 out of many, and already investment policy, and they're not, I think they're not part of the trust, they're not trust members, something like that. It's made out of secret diaries, and then the board has someone. So
You're going way, way, way deeper than I can.
The thing is that is like you look at many jurisdictions, they try to favor local talent and local things, incline. If there's someone that could provide the service locally, I'd rather hire someone locally because of.
But I'll give, so I don't know about that particular, but I'll give you an example that is not that particular. The Fiscal Oversight Board has Proscar Rose as their legal counsel for bankruptcy. Marty Bienenstock is the managing partner for that practice. Marty is one of the leading bankruptcy attorneys in the nation. And by the way, Puerto Rico's bankruptcy was the largest ever public bankruptcy in the history of the US. We do have local counsel, O'Neill and Borges, and they support Proscar Rose, but I'll give you in that example, if I'm going to play, I'm not talking about pensions, if I'm gonna go to the NBA, I want the best NBA players in my team because that's the level of players the other team is gonna have. And there's a lot of criticism in Puerto Rico about who the board hires. We hired McKinsey, we hired Ernst & Young, Proscar's, Citibank as an investment bank. But the reality, those are the leaders in the world. We cannot say as a board, we're just gonna go with local talent to go play in the NBA, because you're not gonna win the game. So when we were faced with decisions, at least when I was involved in decisions, I had at times to leave my heart out of it and say, well, I want a local to do it. Yeah, but I want to win the game. Not specific to that subject, but as a general rule, the Fiscal Oversight Board is not looking at how to be the most liked entity in Puerto Rico. But the Fiscal Oversight Board is always looking at how do we get the best outcome for Puerto Rico. And at least when I was there, like I said before, the work started when the spreadsheet was completed. The issue in Puerto Rico whether it's the rundown buildings or many other matters, is too much government intervention. I feel sometimes we live in a socialist society run by politicians that say they're Republicans, which really makes me question whether they are or they're not. But when you look, for instance, at there's a NGO called the Instituto for Libertad Económica, which is run by Jorge Rodriguez, that they're done a lot of work on this, and they've put out and discovered and really done technical work on the fact that there's so much regulation in Puerto Rico that it actually limits the ability of private enterprise to run efficiently. And I've spoken to friends of mine that are developers that tell me, well, the part of the problem is that to build something, 25% of the cost of the building or the new structure, the new development, goes to paying for the government either regulations or the time wasted in trying to get the permits. Because when you're going to open a business, you have to rent the place, you have to fix the place, but then you have to get all these permits, but you're still paying rent, and you're still throwing money away. And your cash flow, you get a personal loan, or your dad loaned you some money to start a business when you were young, and all of a sudden you're strapped because all the reserve capital you had to start a business, it's gone while you're trying to get the permits, and you cannot get a revenue because you cannot open the door because you don't have a permit. So I don't know the answer, sir, but I do know that we're drowning in regulation.
Well, I would also say some of the larger developments, you have tax credits that come into play, which is funny because the government ties your hands behind your back, makes it more expensive, and then they end up giving you a big piece of the future of Puerto Rico through the tax credits.
Unfortunately, if you ask me, the tax credit is too narrow. The tax credit use is very limited. Now, after I left the board, I know that there's a proposed law to open up investment credits for redevelopment of urban areas. But as far as I know, that law, even though it was approved by the government, was not approved by the board. And typically when that happens is that it has a cost, but it doesn't have a counterweight in terms of reduction in expenses. But I don't know the specifics, but yeah, the summary, at least of my view of this, is over-regulation and too many permits and too much red tape. Yep.
Thank you.
Over here. We'll go back there next.
Okay.
Pásale.
When you were on the oversight, thank you. When you were on the oversight board, what were the main proposals to reduce PREPA debt, and how did APA react to those proposals?
The second one is easy. I really respect Omar Marrero. Really bright guy. Used to talk to him all the time. Very reasonable. So the newspapers like to talk a lot, but the relationship between AFAF and the board was actually, in general, that doesn't mean we agree on everything, but in general, very good. Specific to your PREPA question, I'm going back a few years, but I'll give you the essence of the deal. We were offering 2.5 billion on a 9 billion face value. We got in court, the court to agree that there could be no accruals because the bondholders wanted accruals, so they wanted to make the 9 12.5. But we won in court and we made the 9. We offered 2.5, and like I said, we had 44% subscription. Now, Monday morning quarterbacking or rear view mirror analysis is really easy. So today, right now, I would say maybe we should have gone to 3, or maybe we should have gone to 3.5 and close the deal to get the additional 22% to get to 66, and then have a confirmed plan of adjustment automatically in the district court. But when I left, we were at 2.5, 44% subscription. Now, I'm going top line. I mean, this is very complex, so I'm just giving you the headlines. But the bottom line is we had 44% subscription. And if you're at 44 and you start at 0 when you start the deal, and then you're at 10, and you're at 25, and then you're at 35, all of a sudden you're at 44, you should be able to close the deal. But that did not happen. So what happened instead? The board stuck to 2.5 for over 3 years. Then the board made some decisions that pissed off some people that are very close to the president. And they convinced the president to fire all the board members but one. And then those board members went to court and told the court we were fired illegally. And the federal court at the first instance agreed with the board members. So the board members were restated. But then the Trump administration took that case to the circuit, I think it's Boston. And that's where it stands right now. Now board members have a 3-year appointment. We're 2 years in. The problem with any decision that this current board makes is that if the circuit overturns the local decision, any decision by the board members today will be deemed a non-decision, because they would have not had the power if they win in Boston. So I think we have a lame duck board right now. That's I think where I think we're at. Now, either they win in Boston, and if they win in Boston, they can still be taken to the Supreme Court, but that's going to take more than a year, or their term is going to run out, and we're going to see new board members appointed by Trump. My expectation is that based on the kind of people I've seen Trump appoint before, and I'm going to talk about myself, the board is going to be very much pro bondholder. If the board is pretty much pro bondholder, and editorial comment here, I do believe that the board I was in was really for the people of Puerto Rico. Most people would not agree with that. That's fine, I can sleep with it. But the board was really trying to get the best possible deals for Puerto Rico. If you change the composition and you make it a very right-leaning or MAGA-leaning or pro-bondholder-leaning board, I think that we will get to a deal. It's going to be good for the bondholders, but it's not going to be good for the people. And if you go from 2.5 plus the pensions was about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. The pensions are already in, because pension fund run out of money and the pensions are already in the fee. So 2.5 was roughly 3 cents per kilowatt hour. If you get a deal at 7.5, that's 3 times that. So that's about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. And an electric bill that before the issues in Iran was already around 25. When you add Iran and the current oil price, we might be looking at 50 cents per kilowatt hour if we get a deal like that, which would be really bad for the people. That's actually a really good question. Really good question, because when pharmaceutical companies look at siting, having been there, having been in the room when that happens, they look at multiple factors. A lot of people think that it's all about taxes, but it's not. It's about people. They have the skill. It's about taxes. You know, how much is it going to cost us if we put it in that place? It's about existing infrastructure, roads, education, communications, power, and so forth, and a number of other factors. Eventually, you do a net present value calculation, and you say Singapore versus Ireland versus Puerto Rico or wherever else. But the one thing that happened over the last, I'm going to say, 15 years or so, since the PREPA issue started brewing, is that companies at the top echelon of our economy became independent of the power grid. It's cheaper to make your own energy than to buy the energy at the prices where we're at. So most of the companies, this is one of the issues of why the power is so high in Puerto Rico. I'm going to give you some broad numbers. Let's say that it used to be that consumers were about 30% of the load in Puerto Rico in 2012. Let's say that it was even, for sake of argument. A third consumers, a third industrial, and a third the other rest of the economy, hospital, businesses, malls, and so forth. That's not the case anymore. Industrial is probably 15% or less, and it's about 50-50 between business and commercial. So let's call it 40, 40, and 20. So when a company is going to do that, if you go to Amgen has their own power facility. They use PREP as a backup. So while we in our houses, I'll speak for my house, I have PREP as my main source of energy, and I have a 15K generator in the backyard that runs in propane. At Amgen, or at AbbVie, or at Cooper Vision, and I'm literally not making this up, I know for a fact, they have their own power facilities that run on liquefied natural gas. And we have an LNG port in the southern part of the island where trucks actually get filled up, and they drive those trucks over to their facilities, and they run their facilities on LNG. So that is part of your question.
But that makes them long volatility.
Well, that's an issue by itself, but it's cheaper than relying on PREPA, especially because back 20 years ago, PREPA had high quality, by the way, fluctuations. There were no fluctuations or little fluctuations. There were no blackouts, and it was decent pricing. Today, it has a very high price, high volatility, and is not reliable. If you run a pharmaceutical process and you need sterility, you cannot have a blip in energy. You need to have 24/7, 365 days a year, your conditions to remain the same. Whether you're in biologics, whether you're in your sterile production, or even if you're doing, small molecules. So that became less of an issue. More important issues are things like the GILTI tax on a global basis. If the global tax gets implemented at 50% required to be part of the global network of countries, then Puerto Rico loses its competitiveness because the way we compete is because we provide low taxation. And there's a tax arbitrage between us and where the place is, where the molecule is sold. But if you're forced to be at 15, it lessens the arbitrage. And then when you do your net present value calculations, you have much less of a spread. So I'm much more concerned about GILTI. Now, Biden was actually going for GILTI. Trump has said officially he's not going to go into the global minimum tax environment. And the US walked out of all those discussions. But that's going to come back. I mean, global minimum tax has been around for probably a good 15, 20 years. It's been brewing. Europe, EU already implemented GMT. So that's a much more dangerous exogenous change to the environment. But in the short term, when you look at the Trump policies on tariffs and duties for products coming from outside the US, Puerto Rico comes out a winner. It's kind of like a weird, interesting silver lining to all those policies, because while Puerto Rico is an independent tax jurisdiction from the US, so there's the IRS and there's Puerto Rico Treasury, and they're independent really from each other because of I think that got implemented in the Foraker Act, I think in 1901, and it's been like that ever since. While that is true, we are within the envelope from the customs environment. So we are inside the customs bubble, and therefore there's no tariffs to go from here to the mainland. So all those things come into play too, but I think the current environment is actually favorable for Puerto Rico, given both moving away from GMT, global minimum tax, and the tariffs policies.
And that's our goal.
Come on.
And that is our goal.
No te oigo. Okay, yes, okay. Got another question back there.
I don't need the microphone, I have a loud voice.
All right.
So I wanted to ask you about the Jones Act. Is this
Ah, that's a complicated question. Very complex, a very complex subject. Because everybody in Puerto Rico thinks that the Jones Act is the devil, and that because of the Jones Act, all our prices are higher and this and that and the other thing, but that's not true. That's not true. First of all, when you distribute the incremental cost of Jones Act transportation versus other means of transportation, it dilutes to pennies. It's almost negligible on a per consumable item basis. Secondly, we do get most of our products from the US. So it would make sense that we have products coming out of Jacksonville and Newark and Texas and so forth. And yeah, you could argue that it's more expensive because they need to be US built ships and it's US crews which charge higher than other folks. But I don't think it's as big of a deal than what is being portrayed as. Now, sure, there will be some benefits. Is it going to be a point in the GDP charts? I don't think so. So, I'm giving you a very macro view. Maybe there's some very specific items that could benefit because it's low volume and the actual cost of a Jones Act carrier makes it even higher. But then again, and you probably know this if you're in transportation, Jones Act only applies from American ports to American ports. So if we bring stuff from Africa, if we bring oil from Ukraine, if we bring LNG from the rest of the Caribbean, it doesn't have to go through an American port first. It can come straight to Puerto Rico and there's no Jones Act impact. So a little bit of I think folks try to do a catch-all on the Jones Act. When you actually look at the facts, there's, I think, de minimis impact on actual consumer pricing, and even more de minimis if you look at GDP components of Jones Act. That's my opinion anyways. I'm sure other people have different views. Yes, sir.
As everybody knows, we have a decreasing population, and it's decreasing faster than the census, numbers that most people think. We see in the streets, we see the housing that is abandoned. We see older people that used to work anymore, and we're not paying taxes the way they were paying before. We have heard that the board has a development plan for Puerto Rico. At least I haven't seen it. Maybe it's online, but we know you deal with the fiscal crisis. But what about the development and which industries you see as a past member of the board that could be the ones to really push for the economy? And taking into consideration the demographic factor, I think that's crucial in my point of view.
Well, the one thing the board cannot do is tell people to have more babies, but we do need people to have more babies. That's for sure. The demographic issue is real and it hits us in multiple ways. We have about a 43% workforce utilization percentage, which is actually better than what it was. It was at 40. Your average state is probably around 60, so we're much lower. But then Puerto Rico has some really significant issues in terms of elderly care and child care, which means that there's a number of people that might be participating in the economy by being caregivers both to elderly folks and younger kids, and that's not counted in the statistics. So there's some real differences. Now, I'm going to move away from the demographics and talk a little bit about Medicare, Medicaid, because the biggest issue in the Puerto Rican economy that very few people talk about, although it is the biggest issue of the Puerto Rican economy, is the Medicare Medicaid cliff. Right now, Puerto Rico gets its funding for La Tarjetita through block grants from Congress. That block grant is coming to an end in 2027. That's worth about $2.5, $3 billion. Somebody can correct me here, but somewhere in that neighborhood. And if Congress does not pass a new block grant for the next 5 or 10 years, that means that we are 2.5 billion out of pocket to be able to provide the services that we provide today to the people that use Medicare and Medicaid. Now, to make it worse, the Medicare and Medicaid ratios in Puerto Rico are much lower than in the States. I mean, we're not in Obamacare, we're not in the rest of the laws, so we're a block grant, we're separate. But that also means that the funding is not the same as any other state. The funding is somewhere in the 65 to 70% on a per individual basis of what it is in the States. And when you look at the overall demographics and you look at a hospital environment, for instance, if you go to Miami or you go to Texas or you go to New York, you see these physical buildings that are much better cared for in terms of hospital infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure, but the devil is in the detail. When about 80% of the Puerto Rican population uses La Tarjetita, or this system I'm talking about, and only 20% or maybe 25% at best uses private insurers, that means that Puerto Rico, or 80% of the payers in Puerto Rico, are significantly underpaying for the similar services than in the States. And what happens with the private medical insurance? They pay the same thing as the Tarjetita pays, because why should private insurance, pay for you more than I pay for him? You're doing the same service. But you have the Tarjetita, he's paying with a private insurance. So the entire system is undercapitalized. Now, why do I bring this and I combine it with the demographics question? There's a number of issues in the economy of Puerto Rico that we need to figure out, because they actually deter people from either coming back to the island, or it drives people to move away from the island. Now, I left 3 times Puerto Rico. I left to go to college, and I came back. And I left when I was 25 to go to headquarters, and I came back 10 years later. And then I went again, and I went to live in Brazil, and I came back again. Every single time I left was because I wanted better opportunities in my career. Get a different type of location, get a great job at corporate, go become the CFO of Brazil. Now, I chose to come back. And I told you I took a 70% salary cut from my job in Brazil to come back to be the head of Pritco. But I was still getting decent money. The problem is that when you have people that don't have necessarily the same opportunities, and I don't want to underestimate people's needs, but when you have people that really want to make something of their lives, and they have a US passport that puts them legally in any place in the US, they will choose the path of least resistance. And if they're banging their heads against the system in Puerto Rico and not finding a job that pays enough and not being able to find a residence, and their parents are having troubles with the health care because they cannot get the treatment that they need in Puerto Rico, it will drive everybody to the JetBlue Express. Because it's an easy exit, and it's easy for people to go from Puerto Rico to the US and be part of the workforce there. So I think people that are motivated, that don't have the opportunities that they want here, can easily move. I did it 3 times. So I'm speaking in first person. Now, how do we turn that around? That's the real question. We really need to focus on economic development. To me, that is what truly drives the long-term potential of Puerto Rico. I do believe Puerto Rico has a little bit of an economic death wish, because we do get these great laws like 936, and let's talk about Act 60 and Act 22, and then we have a whole bunch of people saying that's bad, bad, bad for the economy, bad, these people are doing something. Well, that's what moves the economy, that's what creates jobs. That's what puts food in people's tables. That's what provides opportunity for people to do something different than the alternatives that they have. Therefore, I'm always going to be behind laws that drive opportunities for our people. Now, that does not mean, I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. That doesn't mean that we're going to not care about the environment, and that we're not going to not care about doing the thing that's right for somebody that's been living in a place for the last 100 years, and they have title of that property. But that doesn't mean that we should stop every project because I don't like it and because I don't benefit from it. Because I think we have a responsibility to the bigger picture, to create opportunities and drive growth for everybody in the economy.
Do you think the main industry should be pharma, or should we focus on other areas? I know you come from that field, but
So interestingly enough, yes and, not just but, yes and. Look at the overall GDP statistics. About 50% of the GDP of Puerto Rico is manufacturing. 50% of the GDP is manufacturing. I'm going to say it again. 50, one half of the GDP in Puerto Rico is manufacturing. That's about 75 to 100,000 jobs in the island. Very few economies in the world can say that. Now that's good because it's actually very productive and those high skilled, well-paid jobs. But when you have 50% of your economy already in manufacturing and you have about 100,000 jobs, at peak on 936 was about 180,000 jobs. That is a competitive advantage. And then you combine that with attractive tax regimes and foreign policy that increases tariffs for being outside of the bubble, outside of the US environment, you have a really good, strong proposition to say, let's drive growth in my competitive advantages. But we also have bilingual, well-prepared employees that can do export services from Puerto Rico. And I have to say, while you mentioned I come from pharma, most of my economic development work was in aerospace. Why? Aerospace is very interesting in Puerto Rico because they're not here because of taxes. They're here because we're US citizens in US soil. And where you're doing aerospace work that is classified and requires DoD, Department of Defense, or Department of State classifications, you need to be in the US, you need to be in US territories, and you need to have US citizens working on that work. Whether it's trousers for the military, bags, jackets, or semiconductors and electromagnetic interference devices. Therefore, when I was the head of Pritco, I worked very hard to stabilize the pharmaceutical industry because of the 154 shock. That's a whole different story. It takes another 20 minutes of the conversation, so I'll leave it there. But what I told the governor, he actually asked me, he said, Antonio, can you give me economic development strategy for Puerto Rico? And I went back to my office and I got my team together and we sat down. And at the time, this is 2013, we realized, I looked at the map and I said, well, we have 10,000 jobs in textiles. Why? Why would people be doing textiles in Puerto Rico still? It's because there's defense textiles and they have to be done in the US. So they're mainly in Puerto Rico and the reservations, the Indian reservations in the US, because that's where they can get their best tax deals. Okay. And then I saw that we had in the South, at the time it was called United Technologies, it's called Raytheon, I think now. We had United Technologies in the South, and we had a company called, what's the name? We had a company doing design work for airplanes, for engines.
Honeywell?
No, se me fue el nombre. So anyhow, that's not the name anymore because it got bought out. So I said, well, why are these people here? Why are these companies here doing all this technical work? And they told, well, because it's for the Department of Defense, and you need to be in the U.S. soil, and you need to have U.S. citizens. I said, well, maybe we should have an entire strategy on building out the aerospace industry because we're in the U.S. And it actually worked. While I was in government, we actually created between 6,000 and 8,000 jobs in aerospace. And I basically went after it myself. I would go literally, get meetings, go and present the strategy, and we were able to get, Lufthansa came to Puerto Rico in that period. We actually got Lufthansa. And Lufthansa is not the planes, it's not passenger planes. It's the maintenance, repair, and operation. The first Lufthansa MRO in Puerto Rico is in Aguadilla. We built it. I built it for them. I was responsible for the construction of the hangars. And I would negotiate a deal for them to come here. We got Honeywell, which you just mentioned. to do their electromagnetic interference lab. Again, I built the building where they're at on a pre-co facility. We did it as a back-to-back loan because we no longer could get debt. And we got, Pratt & Whitney, which is the name that I was thinking of, but Pratt & Whitney bought them out. Is the company that was doing the engine design that Pratt & Whitney bought, but now it's over maybe 2,000 people. And the aerospace industry has continued to grow tremendously in Puerto Rico. So what do I believe at the end of the day? If I'm running a company, I'm going to look at the competitive advantages of the company and look at the markets where I'm already successful, because I learned in business school a simple lesson that told me that if I own a bakery, it's easier to increase my sales by selling more products to the guy that comes in and buys coffee from me every day. If I can expand the offering and get him to buy a donut or a quesito or come back for lunch, and that's easier than the woman that is crossing the street at the other side that has never been to my store. It's easier to increase my sales with people that are already doing business with me. So the same logic applies. We have a strong pharmaceutical, we have strong biotechnology, we have strong ag bio, we have strong aerospace, we have very strong export services. My view, we need to redouble efforts on the industries that we're known for, that we're good at, and we have demonstrated capabilities. And I told the governor, we need to look for new industries, and we need to look for, actually, this is how I explained it to him. I said, we have to do three things. First, we have to take the companies that are here and get them to commit to some sort of expansion. Maybe it's at a shift, maybe it's at a line, maybe bring an additional product, because by doing so, I make sure that they're deciding to stay rather than deciding to leave, mindset-wise. If they're going to put an additional line, they're not going to put that in the factory they're going to close. They're going to put it in the factory that's going to remain. So number one, get them to do something, but get them to stay rather than leave. Secondly, take the segments of the economy that we have developed competitive advantages and drive growth. Get expansions, get new products, get new companies. And third, new segments that correlate to what you already have. That's how we ended up in aerospace. We had some aerospace, but we didn't have critical mass. But today we have critical mass. And I'll give you a political view on this. I'm pro-Commonwealth, Popular, Democrat, okay? Everybody in the market knows that. I've been even asked to run. I don't think I'm going to do it. But the one thing I don't understand, the pro-statehood party has been in control of Puerto Rico for the last 3 administrations. Aerospace fits perfectly in their narrative. It's about being U.S. citizens. It's about being U.S. soil. It's not about being a Commonwealth, and they're not here for taxes, so they don't need a separate IRS or Treasury. I do not understand why, when I left government, the real drive to grow aerospace didn't continue. Maybe that's a personal view on this, but it actually fits perfectly the pro-statehooders' narrative, why they don't push it harder. But then again, that's my view. I think we're kind of running out of time, right? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.